So we've been walking through this series, The Upside Down, with this idea of whatever's happening in this world, whatever things that we encounter when we go out into our workplaces, out into the world, even in our own churches, we recognize things that don't add up quite right, that don't fit with what we've been taught from the Bible, from church, wherever. And essentially it comes down to a question about how are we reading the text? You see, in North America, we have, there's a lot of wealth here. Even if you're poor, you're somewhat wealthy by the world standards. And so the story of Jesus setting captives free and liberating people from oppression and giving sight to the blind and access to the poor, like those are things that are difficult. I'll name myself here, that are difficult for me as a white man born in North America with lots of privilege. That's difficult for me to grasp onto. What is Jesus actually doing for people in this story? So this whole series is, how do we understand what's actually going on in the Gospels? How do we understand exactly what Jesus is doing when he steps up to begin ministry and begin his ministry and quotes a chapter about liberating the oppressed? What does that mean? How is that the foundation of Jesus' story, right? Because it's all about the heart and sin and this individual thing that I'm supposed to do for myself and make this decision and move on into the next life. That was the story I was taught. So how is Jesus constantly talking about the poor and suffering and oppression? This is a different world. This is a different Bible when you read it from the other side. That's kind of what we're doing. This morning I want to delve a little bit into violence. In essence, we're talking about violence all the way through. Last week we talked about empire, right? And actually empire as an oppressive force, but then creating a new empire to overtake the old empire. That's a violent act. Even if it's not done through violence, it's a violent act. Violence is this way that we live out our world. What do we say? We run into conflict and there's two options. Anyone? Fight? Okay, we know where you're headed. Or run. Fight or flight, right? The world of Jesus looks into the face of this fight or flight and says, actually, it doesn't require fighting or flighting. That's a word. It doesn't require that. It's not what that's about. I don't know how to say this guy's name. A Russian writer. I'm pretty sure his first name is Alexander. I'll skip the last name. He had this line. He said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." You see, we think about this fight or flight, we think about the conflict, and we have to protect. Because every time we step up to say we're going to fight, right? We are right. We are good. And the opponent, the other side, is wrong or bad or evil when it gets really dark. And so it's very easy to say, I'm going to either remove myself from this situation or I'm going to fight this situation. Because we have to win. Because we have to take over. Because we can't let this stand. So this fight or flight thing that we have come to know actually puts us in a really bad place. Can I tell you a terrible thing that my kid did a couple of weeks ago? Can you imagine? Who's a PK? Is there any PKs here? I don't know what this is like. This must be terrible. Anyway, sorry, Kayam, future Kayam. So we had day camp a couple of weeks ago during spring break. First week goes great. Everything's fine. Our kid has some issues. So every once in a while, he's got this fight or flight kind of thing going on. And he makes weird decisions, and I can't explain it. I just can't. It doesn't seem to help being a pastor's kid. And so they went skating. Second week comes around. It's back in day camp. Everything's fine. They go ice skating. He decides to go hang out in the locker room with all the kids' bags and takes 2 kids' bags and puts them in the shower and turns it on. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story. This is another kid. This is not my kid. It just made it more personal, right? You know, sometimes you got to make things more personal to be good. So, in response, he didn't know whose they were. He just thought it was funny, I think. If I knew, maybe we could help. I mean, if they knew, maybe they could help their kid. And in response, another kid takes his jacket, Chaim's jacket, not a friend of the friend. This is now third party, okay? Takes Chaim's jacket into the locker room and pees on it. Now, I'm trying to have this conversation they're trying to have this conversation with their son about what you do when violence is enacted in people. And the response is, we're going to one up and win. Right? And even in a 7-year-old's head, you can watch a bad decision get followed up by a worse decision, get followed up by a retaliation that is even worse. So you can watch this with big kids too, right? Donald Trump moves some ships into a place that makes somebody upset. They respond by firing 4 nuclear missiles into the sea, right? We watch this escalation occur on small scale, and if we're lucky, he learns a lesson on the small scale and he doesn't move to the big scale someday. Or you can watch it on the big scale and watch violence return for violence, return for violence. The fight or flight, whatever, response is so ingrained in us. That anger, that frustration, that desire for justice is so strong in us that we can't stop it very often. And as kids, you get it. Maybe not peeing on somebody's jacket, but you get it. You get angry, you respond. There's no impulse control sometimes. There's no whatever. There's another saying that helps us understand this non-responsive action. It goes like this. It is only when a mosquito It is only when a mosquito lands on your testicles that you realize there is always a way to solve a problem without violence. I couldn't help it. There is another way to do things. And the thing is, for those first 300 years following Jesus, the church seemed to get it. And I don't know how to explain that. We don't obviously have the best historical records to really know what was going on. But one of the core texts for that early church was Matthew chapter 5-7, which begins, "Blessed are the poor." Sorry, we're going to read a little bit of this. Because somehow we've relegated this text to the spiritual realm that doesn't impact us when we are approached with struggle and frustration and anger. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. You see, we've turned, and I think quite naturally, out of the context that we live in, we've turned this story into a story that suits our North American, wealthy, privileged space. And so it's all sort of spiritual. It's all outside of the real world. But when you are looking at a story that lifts up the poor, the broken, the hungry, the world looks different. Our lives look different. That is the upside down world that Jesus tried to show us. I've been reading this book alongside, I think it's called Subversive Jesus. Yeah. And he tells this great story. So I shared a little bit about his story a few weeks ago. He tells this great story. He was in an effort to truly live this life and understand what Jesus was doing. He moved him and his family into the downtown east side of Vancouver. East Hastings. He's living there with a couple of other families in a I don't know what it is, apartment or house or something. And is literally inviting people into his home. He tells this story. He's talking about violence. He's talking about the world. He's talking about these fight or flight moments. And he says, the drugs on our block, just our block, began to get worse and worse. We're having this conversation in Maple Ridge right now. He says the drugs on our block got worse and worse. I would come home and I would have to step over somebody who had overdosed on my porch, or passed out, maybe not overdosed. Or my kids would walk down the streets and into our home and have to step over needles and other drug paraphernalia. Or they would watch drug deals happen out in front of their house. And they would watch these people take advantage of others in this really horrendous way. And one day, there was a dealer known as Crazy Kenny that was dealing on his front porch. And a friend walked in the door. They have this open door kind of place. People just come and go. A friend walked in the door that used to be a gang enforcer. Tattoos all over, huge guy, swastikas like on his face. So this was a rough dude. And he says, Crazy Kenny's dealing on your front porch. You want me to go take care of this? And Craig, who's the author, says, you know what? If anyone could take care of the drug problem on our block, it was this guy. He could walk out onto that porch, deal with this problem, and send the guy packing, and one by one, they could take care of this. And scripture starts running through his head. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And they continue to run through his head, but he's thinking, I could solve this. We could solve this. Fight or flight. Is it time to take my family to another place? Is it too dangerous? Can we solve this problem with this gang enforcer? And the more he thinks about it, the more he struggles with it. And he chooses a non-violent, non-flight response. They get the community together, and on Welfare Wednesday, they have a block party. This is the day that is the drug dealers' victory on that block. There's money around. They're ready to prey on people. Now, most of them have their own problems, right? They have their own fix that they got to get to. They don't care who they're hurting, what's going on, what happens in order to get that next fix. They throw a block party. So instead of having this space filled with drug deals and having this enticement to take your money and go find your dealer, you have something to do that day. Someone that cares about you, someone that loves you, someone that wants to be in your presence. And so instead of going and finding those, they hang out at the block party. Drinks, food, crafts, you name it. They have a great time. In fact, not the first one, but they continue this going forward. In fact, it begins to entice the dealers away from dealing to come enjoy the block party on Welfare Wednesdays. This is not a fight or flight response. It is a need to seek justice, but to do so with the love of Jesus that looks way different than fight or flight. Now, our instincts are strong, and that fight or flight is always there. But we know there's always another way to go about it. We're going to go back to Matthew 5. And just hear these words again. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. I was telling you about that first 300 years. That first 300 years, this text was pivotal in the early church. What happened after that? Thank you. My favorite guy. Constantine changed the way we look at the world. It's not entirely his fault. I don't know if we need to make him out to be an evil person. But with the moment that we replace empire with empire, and what happened there is Constantine turned Christianity into a state religion. And so literally you replaced empire with Christian empire. And we know the violence that has been done in the name of Christianity. I was talking through this with someone a couple of weeks ago. And they were like, yeah, actually, every religion has a history of violence and power and control. There is something about claiming to have the voice of God behind you that gives us this desire to control through violence. Now, you may not be a fighter in the physical sense. I'm almost a pacifist. But a friend of mine was working on his master's. He got jumped by some teenagers. And I thought, he's kind of scrawny, but, I mean, surely. But he just took it. He had the crap beat out of him. And he did nothing. He didn't respond at all. And this blows me away. Because the power of that story happens when you realize our pure instincts are to respond with violence. That's what we do. Not in a hate yourself, you're such a violent person kind of way, but in a just, this is how we respond to that. We fight or we run. And I was blown away when he was telling me this story. This was a few years ago. He was telling me this story about getting jumped by some teenagers and letting it happen. Well, surely not. Now, I'm nearly a pacifist, and I'm pretty sure I would have responded differently. But he believed strongly that violence is not the answer. And so he didn't respond that way. He didn't really run either. It's kind of weird. But here's what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is look at the world. And instead of replacing that empire with empires was what happened with Constantine and what continues. And each of these major religious forces over the last several thousand years have created violence in their path, in their wake. And our call, if we're following Jesus, is to see that, identify it, and to not repeat it. Because when Jesus was faced with violence, he literally, not figurative, not spiritually, he literally handed himself over into that violence. That was the power in his story. We're 2 weeks from Easter Sunday, right? And leading up to that, I want us to identify what's happening in that story that is so powerful, so upside down, so subversive, that it changed the world and people and faith and who God is. All of a sudden we see and identify not with a violent God that has the ultimate retaliative force, but the ultimate subversive force that doesn't run and doesn't have to fight. That's the world of Jesus. I don't know what that looks like for you. I wish I had some answers. But I'd like to hear. If you think about the stories of Craig and this block party, or the drug conversation that's happening, or the homelessness conversation that's happening in Maple Ridge, I'd like to hear what you do with that. What does it look like to not fight or run in that scenario? What does it look like to face suffering and oppression head on, and to respond with grace and love and action?